In the quiet coastal city of St. Petersburg, Florida, where palm trees swayed and the Gulf breeze carried the promise of peace, few could have imagined that a predator was moving unnoticed through their neighborhoods. During the late 1970s and into the 1980s, this city, often associated with sunshine and retirement, became the hunting ground for a man whose violent past should have kept him behind bars. Tony Abels was not an unknown threat. He was a convicted murderer and robber who had already taken a life, been imprisoned, and then released back into society. His parole was meant to represent rehabilitation, a belief that justice had been served and that he no longer posed a danger. But the reality would prove far darker. After his release, Abels would go on to kill at least 3 women, leaving behind shattered families and a city grappling with how such a failure could happen. Tony Abels' early life offered warning signs that, in hindsight, feel impossible to ignore. Born into instability, he grew up surrounded by neglect, violence, and emotional detachment. Friends and acquaintances later described him as volatile, unpredictable, and quick to anger. He drifted through life without meaningful relationships, struggling to maintain work or stability. From an early age, Abels showed little regard for authority or rules, often engaging in petty crimes that escalated over time. What began as theft and aggression gradually evolved into something far more sinister. By the time he reached adulthood, his pattern was clear. He used violence as a tool, intimidation as a language, and fear as a means of control. These traits would eventually culminate in his first known killing, a crime that should have permanently removed him from the public. Abels' first murder occurred during a robbery, an act driven by desperation, rage, and a complete disregard for human life. The details of that crime painted a chilling portrait of a man capable of extreme violence without remorse. The victim was overpowered, robbed, and ultimately killed, not because it was necessary, but because Abels chose brutality. When he was arrested, the evidence was overwhelming, and he was convicted. The court sentenced him to prison, and for a time, the system appeared to work. He was removed from society, placed behind concrete walls, and labeled a murderer. Families of the victim believed justice had been served, trusting that the sentence meant safety. Yet even as Abels sat in a cell, the clock was ticking toward a decision that would change multiple lives forever: parole. During his time in prison, Abels did little to suggest genuine rehabilitation. While he participated in basic programs and followed rules just well enough to avoid trouble, there were no signs of remorse or accountability. Psychological evaluations reportedly raised concerns about his lack of empathy and impulsive aggression, but these warnings were weighed against overcrowded prisons and a growing belief in second chances. When his parole hearing arrived, Abels presented himself as reformed, expressing regret in carefully chosen words. The parole board ultimately approved his release, placing conditions on his freedom and trusting that supervision would be enough. With that decision, a convicted killer was returned to the streets of St. Petersburg, a city unaware that a dangerous chapter was beginning. Once released, Tony Abels struggled almost immediately. He failed to maintain steady employment, drifted between temporary living situations, and quickly returned to criminal behavior. Though under parole supervision, enforcement was inconsistent, and red flags went unnoticed or unaddressed. Abels frequented bars, low-income neighborhoods, and areas where vulnerable women lived alone. He targeted those he believed would not be missed quickly: women with limited support systems, financial struggles, or transient lifestyles. His criminal behavior escalated in silence, masked by the illusion that he was simply another troubled man trying to survive. In reality, Abels was reverting to what he knew best: control through violence. The first woman killed after his parole was discovered too late for help. Her death shocked those who knew her, but initially, there was no immediate connection to Abels. The crime scene suggested robbery, but the brutality went beyond theft. Investigators noted signs of rage, overkill, and personal violence. She had been beaten and murdered in her own space, a violation that sent ripples of fear through the community. At the time, police lacked enough evidence to identify a suspect, and the case went cold. Meanwhile, Abels continued to move freely, unseen by law enforcement and unchecked by the system that had released him. Months later, another woman was found dead under eerily similar circumstances. Again, robbery appeared to be the motive, but again, the violence told a deeper story. The pattern was emerging: lone women, sudden attacks, stolen belongings, and fatal force. Detectives began to suspect a serial offender, but resources were limited, and communication between agencies was fragmented. St. Petersburg was not accustomed to serial violence, and the idea that a paroled murderer could be responsible was not immediately considered. Each delay allowed Abels more time, more opportunity, and more victims. The third known victim solidified investigators' fears. Her murder mirrored the others almost exactly, leaving little doubt that the same person was responsible. Fear spread rapidly through the city, particularly among women living alone. Doors were locked earlier. Lights stayed on longer. Trust dissolved. As pressure mounted, police re-examined known offenders in the area, including parolees with violent histories. Tony Abels' name resurfaced, buried in files that detailed his past murder and robbery. When detectives began connecting timelines, locations, and behavior, the truth became impossible to ignore. The third known victim solidified investigators' fears. Her murder mirrored the others almost exactly, leaving little doubt that the same person was responsible. Fear spread rapidly through the city, particularly among women living alone. Doors were locked earlier. Lights stayed on longer. Trust dissolved. As pressure mounted, police re-examined known offenders in the area, including parolees with violent histories. Tony Abels' name resurfaced, buried in files that detailed his past murder and robbery. When detectives began connecting timelines, locations, and behavior, the truth became impossible to ignore. As the legal process unfolded, families of the victims were forced to relive their pain in courtrooms filled with cold facts and procedural language. They listened as prosecutors described how Abels had taken lives with no mercy, no hesitation, and no remorse. Defense arguments attempted to shift blame to circumstance, addiction, and hardship, but the evidence spoke louder. The jury saw Abels for what he was, a repeat killer enabled by a broken system. When the guilty verdict was finally delivered, there was relief, but no celebration. Justice came too late. Tony Abels was sentenced to life imprisonment, ensuring he would never again walk free. For many, this outcome brought a grim sense of closure, but it also raised uncomfortable questions. How had a convicted murderer been released? Why were warning signs ignored? And how many lives could have been saved if parole decisions had prioritized public safety over optimism? These questions echoed through St. Petersburg long after the trial ended. The Abels case became a symbol of parole failure in Florida, prompting reviews of supervision practices and risk assessments. It exposed the dangerous gap between policy and reality, where paperwork and overcrowding outweighed human lives. Lawmakers cited the case during debates on sentencing reform, while victim advocates demanded stricter monitoring of violent offenders. Though changes were discussed, no reform could undo the damage already done. For the families of the women Abels murdered, grief became a permanent companion. Birthdays passed without celebration. Holidays arrived with empty chairs. Their loved ones were reduced to names in court transcripts and headlines, but to those who knew them, they were irreplaceable. They were daughters, sisters, friends, women whose lives ended not by chance, but by negligence. St. Petersburg itself was forever changed. The illusion of safety was shattered, replaced by a sobering awareness that danger can hide in plain sight. Neighbors learned to be vigilant, communities learned to question, and trust in the justice system was permanently shaken. The city carried the scars quietly, remembering the victims even as time moved forward. Tony Abels now exists only within prison walls, his name etched into records as a man who killed, was forgiven, and killed again. His story is not one of mystery, but of warning. It demonstrates what happens when accountability is compromised and violent pasts are minimized. The consequences were irreversible. This case serves as a grim reminder that parole is not just a legal decision, it is a moral one. Every release carries responsibility, and every failure carries a cost. In the case of Tony Abels, that cost was measured in lives lost and families destroyed. Today, the story remains a chilling chapter in Florida's criminal history. It is revisited not for sensationalism, but for awareness. Because remembering the victims means demanding better systems, stronger protections, and decisions rooted in caution rather than hope alone. In the end, Tony Abels did not just murder women, he exposed the cracks in justice itself. And those cracks, if ignored, have the power to claim lives long after a prison door opens. Long after the courtroom lights dimmed, the failures surrounding Tony Abels' release continued to trouble law enforcement officials and policymakers alike. Internal reviews revealed gaps in supervision that were both procedural and human. Parole officers carried overwhelming caseloads, making meaningful monitoring nearly impossible. Reports of Abels' instability, unemployment, and associations were either delayed or dismissed as manageable risks. In hindsight, Those warning signs read like a checklist of imminent danger. Yet at the time, they were absorbed into a system conditioned to normalize risk. The belief that violent offenders could be safely reintegrated without intensive oversight proved tragically flawed. Abels exploited those blind spots, moving freely while his violence escalated unchecked. Each missed report, each overlooked violation, contributed silently to the deaths that followed. For investigators who worked the case, the emotional toll was lasting. Many carried guilt that went beyond professional responsibility. They knew Abel's file. They had seen his history. Some admitted later that if information sharing had been stronger, if resources had been better allocated, intervention might have occurred earlier. Detectives revisiting the crime scenes spoke of the haunting similarities, the same signs of struggle, the same ruthless efficiency. Patterns that became obvious only after multiple women were dead. These were not crimes of passion or desperation. They were crimes of entitlement and dominance. Abels believed he could take and destroy without consequence, a belief reinforced every day he remained free after his parole. The media coverage surrounding the case brought national attention to St. Petersburg, casting the city in an unfamiliar and uncomfortable spotlight. Headlines questioned how a convicted killer had been released and allowed to strike again. Public outrage grew as details emerged, and pressure mounted on state officials to respond. Community meetings filled with anger, grief, and fear. Residents demanded accountability, not just from Abels, but from the institutions that failed to protect them. For many women, daily routines changed permanently. Simple acts, walking to a car, answering a knock, living alone, were now accompanied by caution and anxiety. Trust, once broken, was not easily restored. Legal scholars later cited the Abels case as a stark example of predictive failure within criminal justice systems. Risk assessment tools, still in early stages at the time, relied heavily on behavior during incarceration rather than underlying psychological traits. Abels had learned how to appear compliant, how to say the right things when evaluated, and how to mask his intent. His release exposed the limitations of measuring danger through surface-level compliance. True rehabilitation requires accountability, empathy, and change, qualities Abels never possessed. Instead, the system confused silence for reform and obedience for remorse, with deadly consequences. Within prison walls, Tony Abels faded into obscurity, stripped of the freedom he once abused. Inmates described him as isolated, quiet, and emotionally detached. There were no public confessions, no expressions of regret that carried weight. For the families of his victims, his imprisonment brought little comfort beyond the certainty that he could no longer harm anyone else. Some refused to say his name again. Others followed parole reform debates closely, determined that their loss would not be meaningless. Their grief transformed into advocacy, a demand that victims be remembered not as statistics, but as lives that mattered. The women Abels murdered were not defined by the way they died, yet history often reduces them to footnotes in a criminal's story. They had routines, dreams, and struggles that ended abruptly and unjustly. Friends remembered laughter, kindness, and resilience. Families remembered voices that no longer answered the phone. Their absence reshaped lives in ways no sentence could repair. Each victim represented a future stolen, a reminder that violence echoes far beyond the moment it occurs. In honoring them, communities are reminded why justice must be proactive, not reactive. Over time, Florida implemented incremental changes to parole supervision, though critics argue those reforms came too slowly. Increased monitoring, stricter conditions for violent offenders, and improved data sharing were introduced, often citing cases like Abels as justification. Still, debates continue over how much risk society should tolerate in the name of rehabilitation. The Abels story remains central to that discussion, a cautionary example used in classrooms, courtrooms, and policy meetings. It underscores the reality that hope alone cannot guide decisions involving public safety. St. Petersburg has changed since those years, but memory lingers in quiet ways. Older residents still recall the fear, the patrol cars, the news reports that interrupted normal life. Younger generations learn about the case through archives and documentaries, often stunned that such violence occurred in a place they associate with calm and beauty. The city continues to grow, yet its history includes this dark chapter, a reminder that no community is immune to systemic failure. Tony Abels' legacy is not confined to prison records or court transcripts. It exists in the policies rewritten, the families forever altered, and the lessons painfully learned. His crimes forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about parole, punishment, and prevention. They revealed how easily danger can re-enter society when vigilance fades. Abels did not outsmart the system. He simply waited for it to look away. True crime stories often focus on the offender, but the deeper narrative lies in accountability. Who is responsible when known threats are released? How should risk be measured? And how many warnings are enough before action is taken? The Abels case does not offer easy answers, only consequences. It challenges audiences to look beyond the individual and examine the structures that allowed repeated violence to occur. Remembering this case is not about fear, it is about responsibility. It is about recognizing that justice systems exist to protect lives, not manage paperwork. When those systems fail, the cost is irreversible. Tony Abels' story stands as evidence that decisions made behind closed doors can echo in the lives of strangers, sometimes fatally. In the end, the story of Tony Abels is not just about a man who killed, was released, and killed again. It is about the fragile balance between mercy and safety, and what happens when that balance collapses. The women he murdered deserve remembrance, not as victims of chance, but as casualties of neglect. Their stories demand vigilance, accountability, and the resolve to ensure that history does not repeat itself.